The Teaching Story. Observations on the folklore of our modern thought. Followed by extracts from the Dermis Probe, both by Idries Shah. The Teaching Story originally appeared in Point No. 4, winter 1968-69. Both works are produced and published in this recording in 1998 by arrangement with the estate of Idries Shah, which holds the copyright therein. The Teaching Story is read by David Wade, and the extracts by members of the London College of Storytellers.
There is no nation, no community without its stories. Children are brought up on fairy tales. Cults and religions depend upon them for moral instruction. They are used for entertainment and for training. They are usually catalogued as myths, as humorous tales, as semi-historical fact, and so on, in accordance with what people believe to be their origin and function. But what a story can be used for is often what it was originally intended to be used for. The fables of all nations provide a really remarkable example of this, because, if you can understand them at a technical level, they provide the most striking evidence of the persistence of a consistent teaching, preserved sometimes through mere repetition, yet handed down and prized simply because they give a stimulus to the imagination or entertainment for the people at large. There are very few people nowadays who are able to make the necessary use of stories. Those who know about the higher level of being represented by stories can learn something from them, but very little. Those who can experience this level can teach the use of stories. But first of all, we must allow the working hypothesis that there may be such a level operative in stories. We must approach them from the point of view that they may, on that level, be documents of technical value, an ancient yet still irreplaceable method of arranging and transmitting a knowledge which cannot be put in any other way. In this sense, such stories, because all stories are not technical literature, such stories may be regarded as part of a curriculum, and as valid a representation of fact as, for instance, any mathematical formula or scientific textbook. Like any scientific textbook or mathematical formula, however, stories depend, for their higher power, upon someone to understand them at the higher level, someone who can establish their validity in a course of study, people who are prepared to study and use them, and so on. At this point, we can see quite easily that our conditioning, which trains us to use stories for amusement purposes, is generally in itself sufficient to prevent us from making any serious study of stories as a vehicle for higher teaching. This tendency, the human tendency to regard anything as of use to man on a lower level than it could operate, runs through much of our studies and has to be marked well. Yet traditions about stories do in fact linger here and there. People say that certain stories, if repeated, will provide some sort of good luck, or that tales have meanings which have been forgotten, and the like. But what would be called in contemporary speech the security aspect of stories is almost complete in the case of the genre which we call teaching stories, because of another factor. This factor is the operation of the law that a story, like a scientific, industrial formula, say, can have its developmental or teaching effect only upon a person correctly prepared for its understanding. This is why we must use stories in a manner which will enable us to harvest their value for us in a given situation. There is another problem which has to be appreciated when dealing with stories. Unlike scientific formulae, they have a whole series of developmental effects. In accordance with the degree of preparation of an individual and a group, so will the successive layers of the story become apparent. Outside of a proper school, where the method and content of stories is understood, there is almost no chance of an arbitrary study of stories yielding much. But we have to go back to an even earlier stage in order to ground ourselves, prepare ourselves for the value of the story. This is the stage at which we can familiarize ourselves with the story and regard it as a consistent and productive parallel or allegory of certain states of mind. Its symbols are the characters in the story. The way in which they move conveys to the mind the way in which the human mind can work. In grasping this in terms of men and women, animals and places, movement and manipulation of a tale, we can put ourselves into a relationship with the higher faculties possible to the mind by working on a lower level, the level of visualization. Let us examine a story or two from the foregoing points of view. First, take a story of the elephant in the dark. A number of blind people, or sighted people in a dark house, grope and find an elephant. Each touches only a part. Each gives to his friends outside a different account of what he has experienced. Some think that it was a fan, the ears of the animal. Another takes the legs for pillars, a third the tail for a rope, and so on. This has actually been published as a children's book. It appears in the books of Rumi and Sanai. We have made it the subject of a commercial film, the Dermis Probe. This story, on the lowest possible level, makes fun of the scientists and academics who try to explain things through the evidence which they can evaluate and none other. In another direction, on the same level, it is humorous inasmuch as it makes us laugh at the stupidity of people who work on such little evidence. As a philosophical teaching, it says that man is blind and is trying to assess something too great for assessment by means of inadequate tools. In the religious field, it says that God is everywhere and everything, and man gives different names to what seem to him to be separate things, but which are in fact only parts of some greater whole, which he cannot perceive because he is blind, or there is no light. The interpretations are as far and high as anyone can go. Because of this, people address themselves to this story in one or more of these interpretations. They then accept or reject them. Now they can feel happy. They have arrived at an opinion about the matter. According to their conditioning, they produce an answer. Now look at their answers. Some will say that this is a fascinating and touching allegory of the presence of God. Others will say that it is showing people how stupid mankind can be. Some say it is anti-scholastic. Others, that it is just a tale copied by Rumi from Sanai, and so on. Because none of these people can taste an inner content, none will even begin to imagine that one exists. As I say these words, the ordinary mind will easily be able to dispose of them by thinking that this is just someone who has provided a sophisticated explanation for something which cannot be checked. But we are not here to justify ourselves. We are here to open the door of the mind to the possibility that stories might be technical documents. We are here to say that there is a method of making use of these documents. Especially, we are here to say that the most ancient and most important knowledge available to man is in part contained in these documents, and that this form, however primitive or old-fashioned it may seem, is in fact almost the only form in which certain teachings can be captured, preserved, and transmitted. And, too, that these stories are conscious works of art, devised by people who knew exactly what they were doing, for the use of other people who knew exactly what could be done with them. It may take a conventional thinker some time to understand that if he is looking for truth and a hidden teaching, it may be concealed in a form which would be the last, perhaps, which he would consider to be applicable to his search. But in order to possess himself of this knowledge, he must take it from where it really is, not from where he imagines it might be. There is plenty of evidence of the working of this method, that of the story deliberately concocted and passed down in all cultures. We do not have to confine ourselves to Eastern fables. But it is in stories of Eastern origin that we find the most complete and least deteriorated forms of the tradition. We therefore start with them. They lead us, naturally, to the significant documents in the Western and other branches of the tradition. In approaching the study of stories, then, we have to make sure that we reclaim the information that stories contain. Shall we say, a message? In this sense, we are like people whose technology has fallen into disuse, rediscovering the devices used by our ancestors as we become fitted for it. Then we have to realize that we have to familiarize ourselves with certain stories, so that we can hold them in our minds, like memorizing a formula. In this use, the teaching story resembles the mnemonic or formula, which we trot out to help us calculate something, like saying 1 kilo equals 2.2 pounds in weight, or even 30 days hath September. Now, we have to realize that since we are dealing with a form of knowledge which is specific, inasmuch as it is planned to act in a certain way under certain conditions, those conditions must be present if we are to be able to use the story coherently. By coherently, I mean here, if the story is to be the guide whereby we work through the various stages of consciousness open to us. This means that we must not only get to know certain tales, we must study them, or even just familiarize ourselves with them in a certain order. This idea tends to find opposition among literate people who are accustomed to doing their own reading, having been led to believe that the more you read, the more likely you are to know more. But this quantitative approach is absurd when you are dealing with specific material. If you went to the British Museum Library and decided to read everything in it in order to educate yourself, you would not get very far. It is only the ignorant, even in the formal sense, who cannot understand the need for particular kinds of specialization. This is well exemplified by the club porter, who once said to me in all seriousness, "You are a college man, sir. Please explain football pool permutations to me." It is in order to get some possibility of right study that I continually say things like, "Let us get down out of the trees and start to build." So far, however, we have not been saying much more than this. 1. A special, effective, and surpassingly important teaching is contained in certain materials. In this case, the materials are stories. 2. We must accept the possibility before we can begin to approach the study of this knowledge. 3. Having accepted, even as a working hypothesis, the foregoing contentions, we have to set about the study in an efficient manner. In the case of the tales, the efficient manner means to approach the right stories in the right manner, under the right conditions. Failure to adhere to these principles will make it impossible for us to function on the high level needed. If, for example, we settle for merely knowing a lot of stories, we may become mere raconteurs or consumers. If we settle for the moral or social teaching of the story, we simply duplicate the activities of people working in that domain. If we compare stories to try to see where the higher level is, we will not find it, because we do not know, unless guided, which are the ones to compare with each other, under what conditions, what to look for, whether we can perceive the secret content, in what order to approach the matter. So, the story remains a tool as much as anything else. Only the expert can use the tool or produce anything worthwhile with it. Having heard and accepted the above assertions, people always feel impatience. They want to get on with the job. But not knowing that everything takes a minimum time, or at any rate not applying this fact, they destroy the possibility of progress in a real sense. Having established in a certain order the above facts, we have to follow through with a curriculum of study which will enable us to profit by the existence of this wonderful range of material. If you start to study what you take to be teaching stories indiscriminately, you are more than likely to get only a small result, even with the facts already set out. Why is this? Not only because you do not know the conditions under which the study must take place, but because the conditions themselves contain requirements of self-collection which seem to have no relationship to the necessities for familiarizing oneself with the literary form. We must, therefore, work on the mind to enable it to make use of the story, as well as presenting it with the story. This work on the mind is correctly possible only in the living situation, when certain people are grouped together in a certain manner and develop a certain form of rapport. This, and no other, is the purpose of having meetings at which people are physically present. If read hurriedly or with one or other of the customary biases which are common among intellectuals, but not other kinds of thinkers, the foregoing 2 paragraphs will be supposed to contain exclusivistic claims which are not in fact there. This is itself one of the interesting and encouraging symptoms of the present phase of human intellectual folklore. If a tendency can readily be seen manifesting itself, whether in physics, scholasticism, or metaphysics, one may be approaching its solution. What is this tendency? The tendency is to demand a justification of what are taken to be certain claims in the language in which the demand is made. My stressing, for instance, that meetings at which people are present who have been grouped in a certain manner may easily and incorrectly be supposed to state that the kind of learning to which I am referring can take place in no other manner. The intention of the paragraph, however, was simply to refer to one concrete manner in which what I have called a living situation can come about. A meeting of a number of people in a room is the only form of such a situation familiar to any extent to an average reader of such materials as this. I have used the word folklore to refer to a state of mind of modern man closely similar to that of less developed communities. But there is a great difference between the 2 folklores. In what we regard as ingenuous folklore, the individual may believe that certain objects have magical or special characteristics, and he is more or less aware of what these are claimed to be. In modern man's folklore, he believes that certain contentions must be absurd, and holds on to other assumptions, without being aware that he is doing so. He is motivated, in fact, by almost completely hidden prejudices. To illustrate the working of such preconceptions, it is often necessary to provide a shock stimulus. Such a stimulus occurs both in the present series of contentions about the teaching story, because and only because certain information about it is lost to the community being addressed, and exists equally strongly within the frameworks of such stories themselves, when one can view them in a structural manner. This train of thought itself produces an illustration of the relative fragmentation of contemporary minds. Here it is. Although it is a matter of the everyday experience of almost everyone on this planet, irrespective of his stage of culture or his community, that any one thing may have a multiplicity of uses, functions, and meanings, man does not apply this experience to cases which, for some occult reason, he regards as insusceptible to such attention. In other words, a person may admit that an orange has colour, aroma, food value, shape, texture, and so on. And he will readily concede that an orange may be many different things according to what function is desired, observed, or being fulfilled. But if you venture to suggest that, say, a story has an equal range of possible functions, his folkloric evaluating mechanism will make him say, no, a story is for entertainment. Or else something almost as Byzantine, yes, of course. Now, are you talking about the psychological, social, anthropological, or philosophical uses? Nobody has told him that there are, or might be, categories of effective function of a story in ranges which he has not yet experienced, perhaps not yet heard of, perhaps even cannot perceive or even coherently discuss, until a certain basic information process has taken place in his mind. And to this kind of statement the answer is pat and hard to combat. It is, you are trying to be clever. This, you may recall, is only the yah-boo reaction of the school child, who has come up against something which it cannot, at least at that moment, rationalize away or fully understand.
The Dermis Probe. Members of the Commission of World Scientists gaze at a bewildering sight brought to us by television using cameras equipped with close-up lenses of inordinate power. The picture pans across a greyish striated surface, a vista of solid in space, broken here and there by fissures, sometimes curving, sometimes obscured by flat shadows. Nothing moves, nothing grows on the barren area. The harsh roughness of the site hints at a silent, empty mass, an outer skin, as of a larva or a pachyderm, gnarled as though with immemorial age. As we watch, the American commentator's voice sets the scene of this documentary report.
From the beginning of time, man has consistently and untiringly explored his environment. He has striven to extend the threshold of his knowledge, even driving probes deep into outer space.
The British voice of the chairman of the commission is now heard, as the pictures of the object alternate, the angles varying, to give as complete a view as possible of the intimidating, silent bulk.
What we are considering here is the topography of the outer husk, as it were, the skin of the bulk of a mass whose characteristics are...
Now fades in the matter-of-fact report of the laboratory astrophysicist, giving a fragment of his results.
Microscopic sections of this undoubtedly organic material betray a cellular structure strikingly akin to dermic tissue.
The viewers can hear sounds corresponding with the laboratory operation. The astrophysicist continues.
Staining the section with von Glaben's fluid.
He is interrupted, for this is a democratic discussion. The German scientist's rejoinder is clearly heard.
Von Glaben's fluid? May I point out that this was found to be a totally arbitrary method in early 1963, when it was superseded by Kaufer and Blackman's traumatic method. It is totally out of date.
The chairman, like all good chairmen, switches the discussion to bring in another constructive scientist.
No. Yes, quite. However, pending further corroboration, to resume, we can be safe and indeed germane in asking Professor Mukherjee to give us some data on the basis of his Indian experiences with this material.
I can categorically state that positively this material cannot be conclusively classified by conventional categorization. All personnel engaged in the combined Calcutta and Benares project were objective in their subjectivity because they had been subjected to an intense program of induced nirvana. It is also incumbent upon me to say...
But time is running short, and the director of the program fades in the unemotional voice of the American space expert to give another view.
We have recently found that the radiocarbon-90 dating of this material gives us 1, 2, 3 years on the relative time scale with a calculated error of plus or minus 6.0. Tensile strength is directly proportional to bulk, and destruct temperature demonstrates little resistance. Since this material cannot be milled or rolled, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration considers it unsuitable for the fabrication of nose cones. It is therefore declassified.
Now for the radio astronomer's results.
We have definitely established that it is not a quasi-stellar source of radio propagation, but by employing our double basin transmitter, we have been able to record marked scatter, and it could conceivably be used as a selective reflector if a substance with these characteristics were needed for advanced and extremely specialized work.
The German scientist, asked for his opinion again, remarks,
But Kaufer and Blackman have consistently shown that cellular differentiation can be more accurately demonstrated by high magnetic differential illumination and spectroscopic microanalysis.
The chairman feels the time has come to bring the program to a graceful end.
I think that we can all safely conclude that while knowing nothing of the overall picture, all evidence tends to suggest that the specific material in question, while not static and seemingly singularly obstructive and of a rather fibrous character, will undoubtedly reveal itself in its own good time, and indeed take its rightful place in the scheme of things.
The camera zoom lenses are beginning to retreat as the American commentator gives his final ringing phrase.
And will eventually fall before man's ever-questing search.
While the credit lists of participants are being rolled across the picture, it is possible to see that the lenses have retracted to such an extent that for the first time the whole of the object, not just its skin, is visible. It is a large African elephant. But the motto of the Institute of Comparative Dermatography now nearly obscures the picture, getting larger as we read,
The parts are greater than the whole.
The strange becomes commonplace. A scholar asked the great sage Afzal of Iskandariya, "What can you tell me of Alim Azimi, your teacher, to whom you attribute qualities which have fashioned you?" Afzal answered, "His poetry intoxicated me, and his love of mankind suffused me, and his self-sacrificing services elated me." The scholar said, "Such a man would indeed be able to fashion angels." Afzal continued, "Those are the qualities which would have recommended Alim to you. Now for the qualities which enabled him to help men transcend the ordinary. Hazrat Alim Azimi made me irritated, which caused me to examine my irritation to trace its source. Alim Azimi made me angry, so that I could feel and transform my anger. Alim Azimi allowed himself to be attacked, so that people could see the bestiality of his attackers and not join with them. He showed us the strange, so that the strange became commonplace, and we could realize what it really is.
The Yemenite Enquirer. It is related of the great Imam el-Ghazali that he was once sitting silently among a group of his students when a visitor from Yemen was announced. When the Imam made a signal that any question might be asked, the Yemenite said, "How are we to know you, and about your works, and the meaning of your philosophy?" The Imam gave orders for 50 different volumes of his books to be brought and presented to the visitor. He said to him, "Study these books, and you will have the answer to your question." When the Yemenite had left, a disciple asked, "I have no means of understanding the significance of this encounter. Would the Imam care to say anything about it?" El-Ghazali said, "You will learn through digestion of the event." Many years later, after the death of the Imam, someone who had heard of this interchange asked the disciple what wisdom he had acquired from it. The disciple replied, "I have indeed understood it, though personal laziness and superficial thinking veiled the meaning from me for a long time." The Imam was giving the Yemenite an opportunity of familiarizing himself with his teaching in the written form, so that he could eventually transcend the written form. The Imam knew by the questioner's behavior and mode of approach that he had first to struggle against his bias against books. But what would have happened if the questioner had concluded that the Imam had specially favored him by presenting his books to him? The Yemenite would have failed. And what would have happened if the Yemenite had spent all his time trying to torture a meaning from the 50 works? No man can help such people. And what would have happened if the Yemenite had been offended by being given reading matter instead of companionship? That would have shown that the Yemenite was not ready to enter into companionship. Companionship, direct contact, is heralded by the acceptance of the indications of the companion.
The Sleeping Man. Akram was a man who earnestly sought real knowledge, and after many years he arrived at the house of a sage who knew all the secrets of life. Akram asked for the mysteries to be revealed to him, but the wise one merely said, "First things first, and one thing at a time." But after some years of attending the smallest wants of the master, Akram could only say that he had learnt that there would be a golden age after several centuries. "Then I shall travel to those future centuries," said Akram to himself, for he could not imagine that the sage would be able to do anything for him in the meantime. Quitting the presence of the adept, he scoured the world and eventually found someone more to his liking. This was a wonder-working fakir who agreed to put Akram into a 700-year sleep. When he woke up, it was to find himself amid the ruins of a mighty civilization, with the remains of imposing palaces, beautiful gardens overgrown, wonders of all kinds littering the landscape. For days Akram searched for any sign of human life. When the smoke of a small wood fire at last showed a habitation, he found beside it a wild and solitary dervish dressed in patches. "I seek the golden age," said Akram. "You have missed it by 200 years," said the dervish.
Reading. A Sufi went to the court of a certain king. The scholars who surrounded the throne said, "Your Majesty, this man must not be allowed to speak until he has satisfied us that he knows in detail the classical books and commentaries, because otherwise he might harbor thoughts which could be harmful to the kingdom." But the Sufi could not recite any classics, and his manner of speaking was foreign to the scholars, who called him a charlatan
and had him turned away. 6 months later, the Sufi appeared again and presented himself to the master of ceremonies. "You are not allowed into the court as a learned man, Sufi," said the master, "since you have failed the test." "But I am not here as a learned man," said the Sufi. "I come as one who brings a present for His Majesty." He indicated a horse which was following him.
When he was admitted into the royal presence, the Sufi said, "I have dared to bring this horse to your Majesty because it has characteristics which I think worthy of a sovereign's attention." "And what are those?" said the king.
"Cause any volume of the classics to be brought," said the Sufi. As soon as the book was produced and put before the horse, it started to turn over the leaves with its hooves. From time to time it paused, looked at the Sufi, and neighed. "Good heavens," said the king, "this horse is reading the book and remarking upon passages from it." Is this not even more wonderful than the capacities of the scholars, who, after all, are human beings and better equipped than a horse to read books? Asked the Sufi. "Yes, indeed," said the king, "but I must know how this wonder came about." "If I tell you, your Majesty may be tempted to dismiss all scholars from positions of importance," said the Sufi. "Even at that risk, tell me," said the king. "Well, I trained the horse for 6 months, by putting some oats between the pages of books," said the Sufi. And that was his incentive, to earn a little for each piece that he knew. He supplied the neighing part himself. "But that is just the way that scholars are themselves trained," said the king, "so we can do without them." And that is the story behind the happy tale of Sufistan, the history of the future. You have heard of it, the time and place where real scholars were able to come into being because the horse-like ones and their way of training their successors and sycophants were put to flight by the king who became a Sufi.
The Light Taker. A certain dervish was called Nuagir, Light Taker, because he had a clay pot which took in light from the day, even from a candle, and gave it out when he wanted it to. He was asked by a scholar, "We do not deny the remarkable characteristics of your light-trapping pot, but we do question your rumoured capacity to see into the hearts of men. If you can indeed perceive people's characters and potentialities, how is it that someone has just sold you a melon which proved to be tasteless?" Nuagir said, "Would you care to come with me and undertake an experiment?" This scholar refused, and spread the word that Nuagir was a charlatan. But after many months of this defamation, they both found themselves at the court of the king of the time, and the king showed interest in the dispute. The king said, "It has been conveyed to my ears that this scholar has challenged this dervish, but that he will not allow the dervish to demonstrate his capacities. Such an attitude is a menace to good order and a threat to the general tranquillity of men. The scholar will stand condemned as a jackal, so pronounced by me, unless he agrees to stop talking about facts and allows himself to be exposed to realities. I cannot think that he will reveal himself to be the word drudge that people must conclude him to be, if he were to rely upon uninformed opinion for his proofs, to resort to spleen and personal calumny, or to do any of the other things which mark the pretended as distinct from the real scholar." The dervish and scholar said, "We hear and obey." The dervish took the scholar to the top of a mountain and made him stay with him for 3 days, listening to dervish law. Then he brought him down to a defile in the mountains where a crowd of witnesses were waiting, headed by the king. People were toiling up the track, on horses and mules, with donkeys and on foot, and as they approached, the dervish said, "Look, king and scholar, I shall place my hand on the shoulder of the scholar, lending him some of my perceptiveness. As each person nears yonder bend, he will become aware of their inner thoughts. His awareness will answer his question as to why a dervish does not use his powers all the time." Sure enough, as person after person passed the appointed spot, the scholar's face became more and more haggard as he called out, "That man is loathsome, ugh!" Or, "Do not do what you intend to do, O man, for it will lead to your destruction." And again such things as, "That man who looks evil is to be the means of rescuing large numbers of mankind." His words were so confused that people thought that he must have gone mad. His face became lined as if with great age, and his beard was white when it had been black before. After an hour or so, the scholar wrenched himself free from the dervish's hand and threw himself at the feet of the king. He said, "Your Majesty, I cannot endure this knowledge 1 second longer. I have seen people who looked like saints, and have perceived that they were poseurs. Worse, I have seen people who thought that they were good, and their evil consisted in their thinking that they were on some good path. I have seen and felt things which no man should be expected to experience." The king said, "What wisdom have you gained from this event?" The scholar replied, "I now understand that if anyone were to remain perceptive to the real condition of men all the time, he would go mad." The dervish told him, "Now you know that the dervish law includes the knowledge of when to be awake and when to remain asleep."
The Palace of the Man in Blue. One day a group of people who had been travelling together through a certain country came upon a magnificent palace by the roadside. They stopped to admire it, and a steward came out and said, "My master, the owner of this palace, invites you to pass a little time here. There are refreshments and diversions if you would care to consider yourselves our guests." The travellers delightedly followed the man into the courtyard. Just within was a crowd of people, all watching a man in blue robes. One by one he touched the people, all of whom seemed to be ill. One by one they changed. The lame walked, the pale looked healthy again, the bent straightened. One of the visitors said to his fellows, "But this is the strangest thing that I have ever seen. This man is a healer, and yet, in my own town, I have seen him going from one doctor to another, seeking a cure for various ailments of his own." Within a few minutes the man had finished treating his patients. He dismissed them and led the guests to a banqueting hall where every kind of delicious food was waiting for them. As soon as they had sat down to eat, one of the company said to his neighbours, "This is the strangest thing that I have ever seen. This man gives banquets, and yet in my own town I have seen him begging scraps of bread from door to door." When the meal was finished, the host took them to see his gardens, which covered an immense extent of land. There, amid every conceivable variety of fruit and flowers, an army of gardeners were at work, swarming like ants through the grounds. When the man in blue was out of earshot, yet another of his guests said to the others, "This is the strangest thing that I have ever seen. Here is a man who must employ more than 500 gardeners, and yet, in my own locality, I have seen him desperately seeking work for himself, and often unable to find it." Minute by minute, the wonderment of the visitors increased. It was not diminished when yet another of them said, "This man is well known in my own area. There he is a beggar, piteously stretching out his hand for the smallest coin, yet here he must be spending more money in a day than a king does in a year." And strange though it may seem, each and every one of those people had seen the man in blue at some time or another in circumstances of want and suffering. When they had spent several hours in mingled enjoyment and perplexity, their host said to his steward, "I shall retire now to rest. Please escort our friends back to the highway and satisfy any curiosity that they might have. There may be some detail about which we have neglected to inform them. It would be against the laws of hospitality to allow them to leave us without fulfilling their desires." The steward took the people to the gate of the palace, and they crowded around, all talking at once. One was asking about the healing, another about the food, a third about the poverty, a fourth about the expenditure of their strange host. The steward said, "I have one thing to say which will answer all your questions, for your questions are really all one single question, though they seem to you to be different ones. Here is your answer. My master, through his own self, has in the past given each and every one of you an opportunity to help him. But when a needy man asks for help, and you help him, you help yourself. Thus is the way for man to do good kept open all the time, among all communities, in every possible manner." The steward turned and walked into the palace. As he did so, like a mirage, every vestige of it melted away.